an herb. Oh.
Start over.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alex Jennings. I'm an urban fantasy author living and working in New Orleans. My debut novel, The Ballad of Perilous Graves, came out this summer, both in the US and the UK. And thanks for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation with you tonight.
Yes, me too. And I'm Leslye Penelope. I write epic fantasy, paranormal romance. My latest novel, The Monsters We Defy, is a historical fantasy heist that takes place in 1925 in Washington, D.C. And yeah, I'm super excited to be here and chatting with you about wonderful books, Black futures, Black voices of the future, spirits in the city.
Absolutely. So, one of the comparisons that came up for me while I was reading your book was the work of Edward P. Jones.
Mm.
Like your work and his seem very contiguous with each other. Like, of course, he's on the more mainstream literary side, and yours is more urban fantasy. But there's a commonality there. I felt like you were describing two different sides of the same world in a lot of ways. Are you familiar with his work?
No, I haven't read him. And so that's interesting. Yeah.
He's a DC author. I love his stuff. I think you'd like it too, especially his full length novel, The Known World. But
Mhm.
his short stories are all very masterful as well.
Oh, right. I'll have to check it out. Because yeah, I think that in terms of influences, when I was writing this, I was thinking a lot of Gloria Naylor and Mama Day and Hurt Linden Hills, like those books really were formative for me, and because of the sense of place, and I think of a book like Linden Hills, or even especially Mama Day, also like The Island. Have you read those recently? But I reread Mama Day before this, and I was really trying to capture that kind of creation of a sense of place. Like, what does it mean to have the city as a character?
Right.
And that led me to like this, the voice, like what is the voice of the city? And what would it sound like back then, especially like with the Great Migration. And so that's kind of my family story too, like coming from the South, landing in DC and mixing in with the people who had already been in DC. And so yeah, having that as inspiration. But I will definitely check out Edward P. Jones. Um, for your book, like New Orleans and creating NOLA, like how did that come about, that sense of specific place and creating this version of the city?
It's funny. I think it had a lot to do with moving here as an outsider the summer after Hurricane Katrina, because getting to know the city and getting my bearings here sort of helped me prepare for building this fantastical version of the city. There's so much history, so much culture, and the spirit of the people is so vibrant in New Orleans that honestly, it took me years to get a feel for the city to a degree where I was confident in writing about it on any level. Like I started selling short stories. In fact, the first short story that I sold was written here in New Orleans in 2004, I think. Um, but I didn't set anything here until I'd been living here for about 3 years, just because I didn't want to impose my own um, prejudices or preconceptions on the city.
Mhm.
And the city's been in a sort of pitched battle for its own uh, soul for many years. Like there's a lot of carpetbaggers who come down and just kind of try to profit off of all things New Orleans and sort of package the culture of the city and sell it back up north. And I certainly didn't want to follow in their footsteps. So it was a listening process, and I think my background of like international living really helped with that because this wasn't the first time that I was sort of thrown into the deep end of a culture in a new place.
Mhm.
Um, you know, I was born in Germany, lived in Botswana, Suriname, and Tunisia, and learning to integrate myself into each of those locales with varying degrees of success sort of prepared me for understanding New Orleans and being able to write a fantastic version of the city that still feels authentic and true to life.
Mhm. Yeah. I think there's that it's interesting, like being an insider versus an outsider. And when you live someplace, like when do you start feeling like it's your own? Like you do feel like an insider at some point. Because I haven't lived as many places. I did move around a lot as a kid because I was born in New York. We lived in DC, then New Jersey, then Maryland, went to grad school in California. And I tend to write a lot about San Francisco because I lived in Oakland when I was in grad school. And I have other books and stories that are set in San Francisco because I loved that city. And I don't know that I ever started feeling like an insider, but I did observe it a lot. And since, we're kind of writing speculative fiction, we get to shape and mold the city that we're writing about. So even if we don't feel like insiders, like that perspective, whatever that unique perspective is that makes you love a place, gives you an insight into it, I think. Whereas with DC, having grown up next to DC, having my family and been, born and bred in DC, going to Howard, spending so much time here, I definitely felt like an insider and I could bring that, bring that out. But it's a historical, so like there's so much research that I had to do to learn this part of the city that I didn't know anything about. And yeah, I wonder, do you write about some of the other places that you've lived?
Yeah, in the new book, I'm going to be writing about Tunisia a lot, especially in the mid to late '90s,
Mm-hmm.
because that's when I lived there. And like, as far as like the insider versus outsider concept, like there's kind of a double consciousness for me when it comes to New Orleans because I'm very aware of my status as a transplant, and I'm not trying to like co-opt or take ownership of um, people's stories here because it's important not to take up the space meant for somebody else or try and erroneously shape things in my own image. But at the same time, I've lived here for 16 years now. And after 7 years, it finally began to feel like home. Like this is the longest I've lived anywhere on earth. And it is the place dearest to my heart, I'd say. Um, but yeah, there's something so specific about the history, the people, and culture of DC, and there's so many layers to it because it's a seat of governmental power, but there's also like a burgeoning artistic and musical community that is very black and like very powerful in terms of like shaping culture along the Eastern Seaboard. Like you can feel it in Baltimore, you feel it a little bit in New York, you can feel it as you go south. And I felt that really came through in your work.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, DC is many cities. And I think that, especially when you're from here, like I don't connect DC in my mind with the seat of power, with government. Like it's there, but like that's not the DC where my grandmother lived and my cousins and my aunties live. That's not the DC I visited all the time because that was a very separate city. And even in the research, there's the only book I couldn't get. I was writing this during the pandemic and I was looking for resources, and there's a book that all these other books referenced that I just couldn't get, and it's called The Secret City, and it's really about Black life in Washington D.C. and like the history and all of these different like histories from I think post Civil War into modernish times. And I was like, I really want to get my hands on this book because everybody is referencing it. It's in everyone's bibliography.
Oh yeah.
It is. There's multiple cities, and there's Black DC is totally different from, white DC and other cultures who come here. But yeah, the government is like its own thing. And if you live here, you don't even deal with it. It doesn't even feel like the same place.
Yeah, I think the reason why I came in contact with it so often is partly because my dad worked for the State Department, which is why we moved around so much. Um, but yeah, like the family that I have there, aren't connected to that, and it's not very much on their mind as they go about their day-to-day business.
Right.
Did you ever get a hold of The Secret City?
I didn't. By the time the libraries opened up, I was done. I turned the book in, and I think if I set another book in this, during that time or during any kind of historical time period, I will get a copy of it, and just to see what I've been missing. It's one of those things where I was like, I got so into the research that I wanted everything. I wanted to know everything, and it killed me that I was missing this one resource that I was sure would open up all kinds of worlds for me.
Yeah, I feel that way a lot of the time. Like there weren't a lot of resources that I wasn't able to get my hands on when I was working on Ballad of Perilous Graves, but there were a couple things. Like I had access when I was going to UNO to I'm drawing a blank on the name of this music magazine that used to be edited by a woman named Connie Sienna Atkinson, that has like all of this really good, meticulous music journalism, and a lot of it focusing on New Orleans musicians. But like by the time the work on the book was in full swing, I wasn't going to UNO anymore, and like I couldn't find that copy, and I was so sad about it. But there's a lot of really good stuff that's readily available, and I found out a lot just from listening to the way people talk about the city. Um, "Ain't there no more" is a big phrase in the New Orleans vocabulary. People discuss the city in terms of landmarks that no longer exist,
Mm.
or businesses that have moved from one place to another, and it really helps sort of gain an insight into the nature of the city's life, like, and the city's personality. And I found that super helpful. I also ran into a lot of stuff in dreams. Like a lot of stuff just occurred to me while I was asleep at night, like the Department of Streets and Lafcadio O'Hearn and everything.
Yeah, those are great gifts. Those are wonderful gifts. I think so. I know that you spent a long time crafting this book. It was sort of had a long gestation process. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it took me about 10 years. It was a really long time. I think when I started it, I just was nowhere near the writer that I would need to be to pull it off. And in the process of creating it, in the process of like connecting with the work and making it shine the way I wanted to, like I was sort of transmuted into the person that I needed to be to like get it out. And I'm glad that worked out, because it was iffy for a while there. Um, I wanted to ask you, were there any major surprises that you came across while working on Monsters We Defy? Like, what jumped out at you that was different from the way that you expected or planned it?
I wasn't sure that I knew how to write it. Well, I knew I did not know how to write a heist at the beginning, but that was the core of what I wanted to accomplish. So I did my heist research, and I was trying to kind of make it twisty and turny at a certain point, and try to amp that up. But it went a little against sort of my nature, or I'm a plotter, and I do like to plot, and I do like to have some surprises, but yeah, trying to craft everything so that you're balancing this plot element, the kind of plot heavy heistness, with the characters and all the emotions that I wanted to have. And so I don't know if it's a surprise necessarily, but just the process of making it all work together was very iterative. I had my first draft that I turned in to my editor, and she worked with me to get more of that in there, because I wanted it. I just, sometimes you work on something and you get to the point where you've done everything you can, and then someone else has to be like, just give you something. They're telling you maybe something's not working, or some idea or suggestion that might not be the actual thing you do, but sparks the thing that needs to happen. And that was, when I got that idea for the spark, that kind of fixed the problem that I was having, that allowed me to make a twist. And also, I feel like it's a gift because it leverages the things that I had already put in there. Sometimes you're laying seeds and you don't know what those seeds are going to grow into. And at a certain point, when you see them sprout, you're like, oh, I did that. I set that up. All I have to do is bring it home. Those are
Right.
really wonderful moments as an author. So yeah, I guess that's kind of the surprise, where I had it all plotted out, and it was fine, but like I knew that I could lift it to another level. And that was the gift that came, when it was that realization of what I could do and how I could make it fit together with the things that I'd already, laid out, and then tweaking and changing a few other of the earlier things.
Right. Yeah. Nivea Evans is the first long form editor that I've ever worked with. Um, but like the way she is able to identify the strengths of a story and like help you amplify them without being overbearing about it is so like it just comes across as so masterful to me. And like I was so grateful to discover this process with her. Now,
Mhm.
have you worked with other long form editors? I think you're with Nivea as well, right?
I'm with Nivea for this book. Yes, I had another series at another publisher, so I worked with other editors, but she is amazing. I think every editor has their own style and is really unique. And I definitely enjoy working with her. I feel like she's so responsive and communicative, and that she really understood what I was trying to do with the book. And like you said, pointing out the strengths and then pointing out the areas for improvement in a way that doesn't feel like oppressive. Like I've had other editors, because I also do self-publishing, so like freelance editors, where they're good with story, but sometimes it's a lot, and you feel overwhelmed, and an edit that doesn't go quite right can kill your joy for the story, or can actually like change the way you feel about the story.
Right.
And yeah, so I feel really grateful to be working with her. And it was a really wonderful process that, and I believe that working with editors makes you a better writer. Like every time you revise, every time you're pushed to do something new, you're becoming stronger and you're working those muscles.
I certainly think so, yeah. Um, I'm going to be meeting her for the first time at
Oh
the
yeah,
World Fantasy Convention down here next week. I'm very excited about
I'm
that.
jealous.
It's nice to have emerged from the pandemic just enough to finally like meet some of the people that I've been working with for years at this weird turning point in my career. Um, I wanted to ask you, like, how much of the speculative element of the monsters we defy is like sort of based in reality? Because it seems to fall in line with a lot of like the folklore that I've heard in the Black community, and like even some of the personal experiences related to me by family members. And so like where did that side of things come from?
Yeah, absolutely. That was what I was trying to do. I've written epic fantasy and created whole magic systems that have nothing to do with anything before. And for this one, I just wanted it to be really grounded and based in African American folk magic, in like conjure and hoodoo, things like that. So taking things that I've heard from family members, just the anecdotes, whatever, the old wives' tales, um, things my grandmother used to say, that we don't know why we do this. This is just a thing we do because my grandmother told me to do this. And also crafting into something that looks like something new. So I did research on hoodoo and how kind of this African American folk magic presents itself throughout this country, and it's very regional. It's very different if you are in New Orleans versus Virginia, where some of my family in North Carolina, and how that kind of mixes and merges as people come together from different parts of the country, come up through the Great Migration, and end up in these cities. And so yeah, I really wanted to make it feel like something that maybe you had, a family member talk about, but like codify it in a way so that it makes sense in the story. And so that I have certain rules in place that I could, it's always helpful for me to have kind of boxes to live within in terms of the story, so that I can just that have these touch points that make everything make a little bit more sense and fall into line. And so I thought about how can I not only how does it for the characters, like their experience of the enigmas, which are the spirits that give them powers, but their own gifts, their own charms and tricks. And the idea of the bargaining. There's always a cost to everything. especially in things like hoodoo. And you have, whether you call it a spell or whatever, there's a cost to it, and making sure that that was an important part of the system, and then taking from all these different traditions that are sort of syncretized with religion to a certain degree, and people can practice conjure and also be Christian, and there's a lot of coincidences, like things that coincide with those things. So absolutely, I was really trying to make it feel very Black and very just rooted in Black American culture and experiences.
Yeah, it's really lovely to see so many of those things making their way more firmly into the mainstream, like be it in genre fiction or literary fiction or elsewhere these days. So
Yeah.
we've got some questions in the chat, and the first one is, what other cities would you like to set books in?
Mm.
To answer for myself, I really would like someday to set something in Columbia, Maryland. That's where I spent the bulk of my childhood. I haven't done it quite yet, but we'll certainly get to it. Some of my short stories take place there, and now like the piece that I'm working on is going to be set mainly in Tunisia. But I like going back and looking at places that I've spent long or important periods of time. So like Paramaribo, Suriname would definitely be one, and Olympia, Washington for sure.
Oh, nice. Yeah, we have the Columbia, Maryland connection, because that is where I currently live, and I grew up in Maryland also. I never actually considered setting a story in Columbia. That's really interesting. Like, it literally never crossed my mind, but I love living in here, so I don't know why. But yeah, stories, places. The book I'm working on now is set in a fictionalized Southern town, which is sort of based a little bit on my father-in-law is from Greensboro, Alabama, which is a very small town outside of Tuscaloosa. And I like the idea of making fictional places that are based in real places, because you're not going to offend anybody who's from there. You're not going to be like, that's not how this was, but you can draw from it. And I love drawing that inspiration. I don't think I've actually set anything in New York, and I'm not sure if I will or not. Like, this book was originally going to be a Harlem book, Harlem Renaissance in Harlem, and then I quickly pivoted to DC. So I think that other places, there aren't a lot of other places where I've lived. I lived in Hampton Roads, Virginia, which I haven't thought about writing about either, just because kind of real world based. Well, that's not entirely true. I was going to say real world based fantasy is a little bit new to me, but I do write
Mhm.
paranormal romance also, which tends to be in our world. And so I think I love Seattle as well as a city. I visited there, and I think that's a great city. But I am kind of looking forward to, I love creating worlds. World building is one of my favorite things. It's why I'm so drawn to speculative fiction. So more of taking a real place and fictionalizing it, fantasizing it, and maybe making it recognizable, or having those touch points where you can maybe see what I based it on, but it's different enough that it's something brand new.
Right, I do love that. Next question is, can you both tell us about your writing process? I don't know. My writing process has changed so much in this period of my career, especially since like I sold this book during the pandemic, and so everything about like the way I interact with the outside world um, changed completely. I used to have a literary reading salon that I ran here in town on a monthly basis, and I would, um, I would run rough drafts of things there, like both short stories and poems and things like that. And not being able to do that anymore was a drastic change. So basically, these days, what I do if I'm trying to write a short story or a chapter is I try to get it down in one sitting or as close to that as possible, and just kind of throw everything on the page and then go back and look at the draft to see what elements might be missing from it and what things might need to be amplified and carried forward to strengthen the themes that I'm looking at. Sometimes themes emerge entirely that way. And I'll realize that the piece is about something completely different than I thought it was. Um, and sometimes it's a process of just sort of listening to what's already there and seeing what it needs. So I do a lot of reading aloud, and I usually do about 4 drafts of the thing, and and then it's finished. Which I was kind of surprised that that bore out for this first novel as well. Like I did 4 drafts, and then we got it off to market.
Nice. Yeah, that's interesting. So my process is usually I start with the kernel of the idea, and half of it is the idea generation and sort of nurturing that. So figuring out what is this idea and how do I turn it into characters and a plot. And like I said, I'm a plotter. So then once I kind of tease it out and sort of tell myself, I write a few paragraphs about what I think it could be, then I try to apply a plotting system just at a high level. So a beat sheet or something like that, which is usually like 11 plot points of where I think that everything has to hit. And then I expand that into an outline of a few pages, and then sort of flush that out into a slightly longer outline. And then I start writing. And my first draft, it sounds similar to Alex's. I call it the fast draft. So I write the entire thing from beginning to end without any editing as fast as I can. And that came from NaNoWriMo, like National Novel Writing Month. And once I finally was able to win and finish and write a 50,000 word draft of something in 30 days, I realized how beneficial that was. Like, not editing yourself allows you to get to the end and make those realizations. Whereas before, I might have tried to polish things and then never get to the end. Inevitably, by the time I get to the end of the first draft, I've completely changed many things that I thought was going to happen. My outline has completely changed. So I haven't spent any time polishing, which is great. And then I usually do another draft to clean it. It's like the polishing draft. And maybe like another half draft just to, make sure that the words are in order. Then usually it goes to the editor for a developmental edit. And so I'm at like 3 drafts and then another major draft after the edit. So it ends up probably being about 4 by the time it's all said and done. But yeah, and usually in the middle of the second draft, I have to sort of reorganize everything anyway, because you're always discovering things that make it better. And I don't like to edit myself until I've made all those discoveries, because however many books later that I've written, it seems to always be the same. I can do the first half of the book pretty clean, and then everything has changed for the end. So I allow myself that space now to know that I'm going to make a lot of changes once I get to the middle, and try to give myself grace and remember with each book, because I inevitably forget that. It's a very frustrating process to go through when I thought I had, you think you have it all carefully plotted, but then you find out, nope, that's not what's going to happen at all. And it can be good, and it also can be a pain.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like I ran into that kind of thing a lot, like how one decision earlier on would change so much of what comes after.
Yeah.
Um, the next question they've got for us is, what advice would you give to aspiring writers of color? I'll let you go first on that.
I think persistence is key. This industry, the publishing industry, has changed so much in just a few years. When I first published my first book in 2015, I didn't try to go for traditional, because I just didn't feel that there was any traditional publisher who wanted what I was writing. And so a few years later, that landscape changed so much. It's continuing to change as people of color being hired into positions of power in publishing houses. So persistence is key. You always need persistence, whether you're submitting, whoever you're submitting to publications, to agents, to editors, and just don't quit. And I think that, I do believe that everyone's story needs to be heard. I think that there is an audience for everyone's story, and you'll only find it if you keep persisting and keep learning and always try to be a better writer. Like, that's something that I don't take for granted. You could always improve your craft, and that requires persistence as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Um, Conan O'Brien of all people gives the advice, like if you keep ringing your bell, sooner or later people start looking around and asking, "What's that bell noise?"
Mhm.
And like that used to kind of irritate me to hear because I was like, oh, of course, like this rich guy who's been on TV for a generation and who wrote for SNL and The Simpsons is saying that. I don't know if that works for normal people like me. But then, in the past few years, I've been seeing that bear out. Um, I think the advice that I would give is similar, but it's that there is nothing wrong with biting off more than you can chew. Like, there's nothing wrong with taking on a task that you know is beyond you, um, because worst case scenario, it teaches you how to experience and deal with failure. And best case scenario, striving for this goal can transform you into the writer or the person you need to be in order to achieve it. Um, so yeah,
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really important to strive for more, bite off more than you can chew. That's really good advice because you can't help but grow when you're doing that.
absolutely. Let's see what else we got. What are books or influences you've studied to help you create your magic systems and or fantasy worlds? Or did it all come to you organically, or did you have to work at it? That is a question from Liz.
So organically versus working at it, I think it's always sort of a push and pull. I think that a lot of things do come like as gifts, that ideas, dreams, these things. And then for me, I have to work to make them make sense. So I like to base magic on something real. I like to ground it in something. So in my first series, Earthsinger Chronicles, the magic in those books is called Earth Song, and that was kind of based on me growing up in like a metaphysical religion. I grew up as a Christian Scientist. I'm not practicing anymore, but the tenets of that were sort of prayer healing. Like that's kind of what it's known for. And the idea behind that is just that you can affect change on your environment through your mindset and through your body, on your body too. And so I kind of took those ideas from this spiritual system that I knew pretty well and figured out how to turn it into kind of a magical system and expand that idea that we're all connected, that there's an energy that runs the universe that we can tap into this magic that's Earth Song. And so, the idea for it was just the light bulb moment sort of that comes in your mind that then requires a lot of work and effort and research and brainstorming just to make it make sense and to make it into a system. I do like harder magic systems sometimes that I can outline and have a little rule book for to help inform the books. So what about you, Alex?
Well, my magic system that I use in Ballad of Perilous Graves is on the messier side, which is purposeful because like it's generally based around musical magic, and it's based on a concept that Dr. Henry Louis Gates called signifying, which is in jazz music especially where you take a snatch of a music, a phrase, and you reiterate it, but add your own imprint and flourishes to it. And so that appears in Black American music as well as Black American storytelling, things like toasts. And so I knew that I needed to come up with a metaphor that would sort of encapsulate that. And the idea that I came up with is that this unnamed form of magic seeks to imitate or recreate the voice of the creator in order to alter reality. And I hope it was successful. I know like some folks weren't quite able to understand what I was getting at, but that's okay because like there are levels of understanding to any artistic pursuit, and like it takes a lot of like study and patience to understand like the features of jazz music and the traditions and where they come from and what they're born out of and what should be observed and what it's okay to ignore, and how to find like a sort of freedom in tradition. So I hope I did a good job representing that.
I actually think you did an amazing job, because I felt like the book is like very jazzy. Like, you know, there's an aesthetic there on the page of things that you can see, but the experience of reading it is, there's a lot of improvisational, and it feels like it's very complex and layered, and maybe it will take another reading to really dig into the things that you were doing, which is like listening to music, like a complicated song where you have lots of, you know, I don't want to say competing melodies, but just lots of, I'm not a musician, but my husband is a musician, and my father-in-law, and the way they talk about music is the way that I don't understand. Like, I'm hearing something completely different than what they're hearing. But I think when you put that into art, when you can give people different experiences of reading, you know, you get the story on the first level, but then there's all these other things that are woven through that maybe do require, you know, a more careful reading and some study to tease out. And that's great. Those are the experiences you're giving the reader.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad that came through. Let's see, what do we have next? Which were your favorite and most tricky characters to write in The Monsters We Defy and The Ballad of Perilous Graves? I know that the trickiest for me had to be Stagger Lee. Uh, he's just he's such an indelible and menacing character, and like there are so many things about that figure in Black American myth and culture that have influenced so much to the present day. Like a lot of the influences in hip hop go back to Stagger Lee. Like even some of the influences in rock and roll. There were storytelling conventions that formed around his story and stories like his. And like the fact that it was born out of a very real murder committed by a very real person at the turn of the 20th century is just fascinating to me. And like he actually scares me. And in writing scenes and interactions for him, there was always the sense that anything could happen. Like I was never 100% sure what he was going to do. And you know, in writing the book, I developed this process where if I didn't feel right about a scene or an element of the plot, I would like sit down in the courtyard behind my apartment and interview one of the characters that was in that scene and like ask them what really happened. And I was kind of surprised when I actually tried that, and it wound up working. But the one person that I never felt I could do that with was Stagger Lee, because A, I didn't want him to know where I lived. and and like it's also very strange and like I guess upsetting in a way to give voice to that part of myself that is Stagger Lee. Like I felt like I didn't really want to wake up that part of my brain. But yeah, he was a doozy.
I feel that sometimes when you're writing villains, I've experienced that where I try to distance myself. Like as a writer, usually I'm trying to embody the character, get in their head, live life through their eyes so I can write them. But in my previous series, I did write some scenes from the villain's perspective, and it was hard. And I was like, how can I do this without sinking down into that? So you have to protect yourself, but also honor the story.
For
Um,
real.
yeah, for me, my favorite character in The Monsters We Defy is Zelda. She is a former circus performer. She has albinism, and so she was sold to the circus as a young person. And a lot of the themes for different characters are how they deal with adversity. And so a lot of them, you know, turn to the spirits in times of adversity, and that they get a charm or a trick, they get powers from the spirits. Zelda is one of the main cast who does not have that. She never made a deal with any of the spirits. And because she deals with adversity amazingly well, she's very resilient. So yeah, she was my favorite character to write. A little bit, people call her morally gray. I think she's a lot of fun, but she does have a different kind of morality, which is a lot very loyal, but not necessarily caring about laws. And then difficult characters, not necessarily a character, but this sort of this voice that I created for the interstitials, which are in between certain chapters. You get the backstory of certain characters, And it's told from a perspective, sort of this like voice of the city perspective, that it took a long time for me to get right, because I wanted it to feel like a character in and of itself, this collective sort of consciousness that is telling you certain things in a certain way. And that became a challenge that I gave myself. It's one of those things where I wasn't sure, I was biting off more than I could chew, because it wasn't something I had done before, and it scared me. And that made me all the more, determined to do it, at least to the best of my ability.
Absolutely. Have you read anything good recently that you recommend?
Whenever anyone asks me this, every book I've ever read flies out of my head. So I'm checking my
Me
read
too.
to be like, what have I read lately? What is going on here?
Well, I mean, something that I'm reading right now is the forthcoming collection by Nisi Shaw, Our Fruiting Bodies, and it is fantastic. Like, I've always loved Nisi's work, and they're a personal friend of mine and have been super kind to me over the years. But man, do they bring it every time. And those short stories are just, they burn up the page. I'm very excited to interview them next week.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I had the opportunity to meet Naomi Novik and read her latest trilogy, which really was fantastic. It wasn't really a genre specific story that I would have read otherwise, but it blew me away. And yeah, and sometimes it's like I'm reading things that haven't come out yet, because I get to do that sometimes. So I don't even know when this book comes out. The Fairy Bargains of Prospect Hill, but writing my blurb for it, because that's actually fantastic. I think it comes out early next year.
Yeah. Oh, I've also been reading Arc Dust by Alex Smith. He's an indie writer out of Philadelphia, and like he's a polymath, and he does music, fashion, activism, all sorts of stuff. And he was a Pew Fellow in 2020, and his work is just fantastic. I love it so much. I've also been reading a lot of Lady Hubbard. Her most recent collection was called The Last Suspicious Holdout. And that's not genre fiction, but she does do a lot of genre fiction. Like her book, The Talented Ribkins, is a fantastic novel about a Black family where everybody has like some sort of specific superpower um, that may or may not be particularly useful. And like her second novel was in some ways a prequel to that one called The Rib King. So good. Maurice Ruffin, The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You. That was a collection of short fiction, like all of it set in and around New Orleans. Beautiful stuff. And I know I'm forgetting things because I always do. Oh, Siren Queen by Nebo. That was a great one. And I'm reading some poetry collections, like Would You Please Sign My Tentacle, a speculative fiction, a speculative poetry volume by Brandon O'Brien, and he does great work. And then Rat King by Samiko Salson. I have it right here, in fact. And Exposed Nerves by Lucy A. Snyder. Oh,
Blurred.
oh well, blurred. But yeah, like a lot of good stuff coming down the pipe, man.
Yeah, there's great. I know Farah Roshan, who's one of my favorite authors, she just hit the New York Times with this, speaking of New Orleans, like a grown-up Tatiana book. I'm starting it. It's called Almost There, or Twisted Tale. And I'm excited about that one.
Excellent. So the next question is, which writers were most inspirational for you both?
Inspired, well, I talked about Gloria Naylor, who definitely I count as an inspiration. Also, Octavia Butler. I don't think we can have a conversation about Black speculative fiction without talking about Octavia Butler, but also Tananarive Due. When I found Black speculative fiction, I just tried to absorb as much as possible. And so like those were people that I still think about, the books and what they were doing. Absolutely. And I'm trying to think, You go, because I think there's more that I've obviously forgotten.
Octavia Butler, definitely. In some ways, she's the one who first invited me into the field. Like, she was the first working writer that I met after falling in love with her work as a boy. I had the chance to meet her at the Evergreen State College when I was going out there, and she told me to apply to Clarion West and said that if I applied, I would get in, and she was right. And that's kind of how I entered the speculative fiction field. Cherie Renee Thomas has been super influential for me over the years. She's just fantastic. Um, Lady Hubbard, of course, Maurice Ruffin, Daniel Jose Older, P. Jelly Clark is certainly up there,
Yeah.
and Edward P. Jones, like I said, especially the known world and his short story collection, All at Hagar's Children, I believe. And then Walter Mosley, like there are just so many.
Yeah, there's inspiration is such a strange thing, but because I tend to think of people I read early, and but peers, people who are helpful. I think P.J. Clark is definitely one of those people who's very generous with time, and yeah, there's definitely other authors who give of themselves and are great to talk to. Like Alyssa Cole is another author who has been super personally helpful to me, and just people who give their time when they don't necessarily need to.
Right.
Oh, we have an FBI question. If the FBI checked your browser history mid-research, what's the strangest search query they'd find?
Oh, that's a really good question.
That is, sometimes I do get a little concerned about what I've been searching. Recently, it's been plants. Nothing too crazy. Although I did make a list of some things I was searching because I was just thinking I'm doing world building now for a new book, and sometimes when you're kind of deep in the world, it's often like what trying to figure out like flora and fauna is a big thing for me because I don't know anything about plants, but the FBI, it doesn't care about that. But explosions, like what would sort of natural gas explosions and how those things occur. And then I was also researching ancient Greek courtship rituals, which might just raise an eyebrow. I don't know.
I've been researching a lot of child sacrifice in Carthage. That's a big one for sure. The spread of the Black Plague was definitely one. Disease vectors and things like that. Also, like some assassination attempts. Like, and I've kind of been thinking and preparing to write a lot about the death of Sam Cooke.
Oh,
I'm not sure what for exactly, whether it's going to be incorporated into a novel or into a short story or something like that. And then like I'll research things for poems sometimes, like specific court cases, things like that. But not a lot of stuff that would be red flag if I was interested in it in real life. This stuff that's kind of like morbid or would make me look like a weirdo, but I am, so that tracks.
I think all writers are. Yeah, I haven't been doing a lot of writing about murders lately, so I'm pretty clean. Another question from Liz. I love character names and book titles and find the process behind them fascinating. With each of your books, A, did your character names change, inform your character's behavior at all? And also looking at book titles and series titles, did anything change or get amended at all?
I mean, yeah, Perry's last name was originally Gates, but that changed. But that was early on in the process, like way before I sold the novel. Um, the title of the novel was originally Peaches. Then it switched to Conjure Music, and then in the final analysis, it came out as the Ballad of Perilous Graves, which was always the best choice for sure.
That's a great title. For me, Knock on wood, I haven't been asked to change a book title yet. So when I first did my proposal, I was going to call it Midnight Music because I wanted to call it The Monsters We Defy, but I wasn't sure. And then I changed it, right? And then I was like, no, this is the title I want. They can tell me if they want to change it. So The Monsters We Defy comes from a poem that's part of the epigraph. It's a Claude McKay poem. And it felt perfect for me. In terms of characters, I do with this book, it's Clara Johnson, the main character, is based on a real person. And she went by Carrie most of her life. So her name was Clara Johnson, but in newspaper articles and everything I could find, she preferred the name Carrie. So I call her Clara as a way to separate her from the real person. Just in my mind, I wanted to be like respectful because I do take her life in a whole different direction. And I just felt for me like that was a way that I could honor the real person while making a character of her. But that's slightly different. Everyone else's name kind of came to me as the name. And aside from Madame Josephine, in the acknowledgements of the book, I mentioned that Josephine was a name that came to me and I changed it because Josephine's my mother's name. And I wasn't sure how she would feel about me naming the antagonist after her. But I finally asked her and got her blessing for that. So I changed it back to Josephine, which was the name that felt like it had the right energy to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely a good choice. Let's see. Can you tell us if there are any women of color authors that you're excited about or think we should keep an eye on? Well, okay. You haven't heard of her yet, but there is a Black woman author out of Boston called Melissa Watkins, who is amazing. And I think she's going to wind up taking the business by storm in the next few years. She has a Korean children's book that she co-wrote that just came out, and I know she has like a bunch of proposals and manuscripts on agents' desks right now, and whoever picks her up is in for a treat because she's amazing.
Yeah, there's so many Black women who are publishing now that are great. I think there's an indie author who I adore. Her name is Jasmine Silvera, who writes sort of urban fantasy books that I just think are wonderful. Another indie author, Cerise Rennie Murphy, is doing amazing work in fantasy and science fiction. I love her. She's a good friend of mine also. And yeah, I think that there's so much on the table. I'm trying to think if there's anyone that I know that's not published or is kind of coming down the road. But I think those are great authors to be on the lookout for.
Danya Dillman is also amazing. I know she's got a book coming out, I think early next year. I'm not sure exactly when, but she's written a lot of short stories that have appeared in various small presses and things, and on podcasts. She's great. Um, Man, I should have kept a better list. Let's see. What are you working on right now? Well, I'm working on a few things, like some I can talk about and some I can't. I'm working on that next novel for Orbit, which is very exciting. But we'll see exactly how that shakes out in the process. Um, I'm working on some short stories. I think, oh, an exclusive, I guess, announcement. Keep it under your hat 'cause we're not totally official yet. But I'm going to be guest editing an issue of the horror journal devoted to works inspired by Thomas Ligotti, Vastarian, from Grimscribe Press. It's just excellent. And I guess that's all I can talk about for now.
Yes, I'm also working on my second book for Orbit. It is the one that takes place in this fictionalized small town in the South, and it's another standalone. So it deals with an all-Black town faced with destruction by the construction of a new dam and how they can save it. A mysterious stranger comes in and offers them a way to save their town. The other book I'm working on is the second in my trilogy, which is post-apocalyptic paranormal romance. The first book is Savage City, and I'm working on Beastly Kingdom, which will come out early next year. And then many more books down the line.
Nice. I cannot wait. Let's see. What other genre, not speculative, would you want to try your hand at? Um, I'm very partial to crime fiction. I've written some short crime fiction and really enjoyed it. I'd like to do a crime novel at some point, I think. Would it be non-speculative? I don't know. Like I do like to mix genres a lot. And I've got one noir piece that would involve vampires that I'm really excited about. We'll see if and when that comes out. Because I'm a big fan of Blackula and Blackula's descendants, like Candyman. So
Yeah, that sounds great. Maybe not crime, but mysteries or thrillers. And they're slightly different, but I would love to do just a mystery, not even maybe a cozy mystery or maybe just something slightly more edgy. But that would be another thing biting off more than I could chew, because like doing all the twists and turns that are necessary for a mystery would be a great challenge. And I do have a paranormal thriller that I think will be after these books, my next book. I don't know exactly how I'm going to pull that one off either. But whether or not the mystery would have speculative elements, they always end up in there. So I can't really help myself. It just, I've tried to write, like, I'm going to do a contemporary, and then the magic and the witches and the fairies show up or whatever. So that doesn't work out so much.
I've had an idea for an Agatha Christie pastiche that I've been kicking around. We'll see if I get to it. But
Yeah.
I
I
don't
think
know.
that would be cool too. That's kind of the idea, like the same vein of what I was thinking, like something in that Agatha Christie. I read a lot of Agatha Christie growing up. And so, yeah, sometimes you want to get back to that.
Enormous fan. Enormous fan.
So yeah, we are at the end of our time. Thank you all so much for joining us. And thanks, Alex. It's been great talking to you. It's always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was great fun. I didn't even realize we were at the end of the time. I'm
Yeah.
glad we answered all those questions then.
Just in time, we got the last one. So thanks again, everyone. And have a wonderful evening / afternoon, wherever you are.
All right. Thank you. And bye, everybody.